The year was 1241, and the thunderous sound of hoofbeats echoed across the Hungarian plains like the drumbeat of approaching doom. What was about medieval Europe thought to unfold would shatter everything it knew about warfare, honor, and the supposed superiority of Christian knights. In a matter of hours, 20,000 Mongol warriors would accomplish what seemed impossible: the complete annihilation of a European army more than 5 times their size. But this wasn't just another battle. This was the moment when two worlds collided with devastating consequences. On one side stood the flower of European chivalry, knights who had spent their entire lives training for combat, encased in steel armor that could deflect sword blows, mounted on powerful war horses bred for battle. These were men who believed their heavy cavalry was invincible, warriors who had carved out kingdoms and conquered lands from the Holy Land to the British Isles. On the other side rode something Europe had never encountered before. These weren't the typical raiders or rival kingdoms they were accustomed to fighting. These were the Mongols, descendants of the steppes who had already conquered the largest land empire in human history. They fought with tactics so alien, so brutally effective, that they would redefine warfare itself. Today, we're going to dissect exactly how this military catastrophe unfolded. We'll examine the precise tactics that turned a numerical disadvantage into a crushing victory, explore the psychological warfare that broke the spirits of seasoned warriors before the real fighting even began, and reveal why this battle marked the beginning of the end for medieval Europe's sense of invincibility. What makes this story even more compelling is that the Europeans had every reason to believe they would win. They outnumbered the Mongols 5-1. They had superior armor, larger horses, and centuries of military tradition. Yet by the end of the day, their army would be scattered to the winds, their commanders dead or fleeing in terror. The Battle of Mohi wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological earthquake that sent shockwaves across the entire continent. Kings and emperors who had never feared any earthly enemy suddenly found themselves fortifying their borders against an enemy they barely understood. The very foundations of medieval warfare were about to be exposed as tragically obsolete. But to understand how 20,000 Mongol warriors achieved this impossible victory, we need to step back and examine the two radically different military cultures that were about to collide. The European approach to warfare in 1241 was built around individual heroism and brute force. Knights were essentially one-man armies, each warrior representing a massive investment in training, equipment, and prestige. These weren't common soldiers. They were the elite of medieval society, men who had spent years learning to fight from horseback while wearing 60 to 80 pounds of steel armor. Their weapons were crafted by master smiths, their horses bred specifically for war, their tactics refined through generations of combat against similar opponents. The European battle doctrine was straightforward and had proven effective for centuries. Form up in tight formations, charge at the enemy with overwhelming force, and use superior armor and weapons to break through enemy lines. It was a system that emphasized courage, individual skill, and the shock value of heavily armored cavalry. But the Mongols represented something entirely different. They were the product of a military revolution that had been brewing on the Asian steppes for generations. Where Europeans valued individual heroism, the Mongols perfected collective discipline. Where Europeans relied on heavy armor and brute force, the Mongols emphasized speed, mobility, and psychological warfare. Every Mongol warrior was essentially a mounted archer first, and a close combat fighter second. They could fire arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop, a skill that took years to master. More importantly, they fought as part of an integrated system where individual glory meant nothing compared to the success of the overall battle plan. The Mongol military machine was built around concepts that wouldn't become standard in European warfare for another 300 years. They used coordinated units that could split apart and reform at will. They employed sophisticated communication systems using flags and horns that allowed commanders to direct complex maneuvers across vast battlefields. They had developed siege techniques that could reduce the strongest fortresses to rubble. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongols understood something about warfare that Europeans had never grasped. Battles weren't won by the bravest warriors, but by the side that could impose its will on the enemy through superior strategy, coordination, and adaptability. The events leading up to the Battle of Mohi began months earlier when the Mongol invasion force led by Batu Khan and the brilliant general Subutai swept into Hungary with terrifying efficiency. This wasn't their first encounter with European forces. They had already devastated Poland, crushing a combined army of Poles, Germans, and French knights at the Battle of Legnica just 2 days before Mohi. King Bela IV of Hungary had gathered what he believed was an unstoppable force. His army included not just Hungarian knights, but also Croatian nobles, Austrian reinforcements, and French crusaders who had been returning from the Holy Land. These were battle-tested warriors who had faced everything from Saracen cavalry to siege warfare in the Middle East. The Hungarian king was confident, perhaps overconfident. His spies had reported the size of the Mongol force, and the numbers seemed manageable. 20,000 riders against his 100,000 soldiers seemed like acceptable odds. What Bela couldn't have known was that he was about to face an enemy that operated by completely different rules. The Mongols had spent weeks studying their opponents, learning their habits, their strengths, and most crucially, their weaknesses. Mongol scouts had observed European battle tactics in previous engagements. They knew exactly how European armies formed up for battle, how they charged, how they retreated, and most importantly, how they could be manipulated. As the two armies approached each other near the Mohi River, the Europeans made their first critical mistake. They assumed the Mongols would fight like every other enemy they had ever faced. They expected a straightforward battle where superior numbers and equipment would decide the outcome. The Mongols, however, had already begun implementing a battle plan that would exploit every weakness in the European approach to warfare. They weren't planning to meet the European charge head-on. They weren't going to engage in the kind of individual combat that European knights excelled at. Instead, they were about to demonstrate why the future of warfare belonged to coordinated, disciplined forces that could adapt and improvise in real time. What happened next would change the course of European history. The battle that unfolded on April 11, 1241, would prove that numbers meant nothing without proper tactics, that individual courage was useless against coordinated strategy, and that the age of the heavily armoured knight as the dominant force on medieval battlefields was coming to an abrupt and bloody end. The stage was set for one of the most one-sided military disasters in European history, a battle that would demonstrate the terrible effectiveness of Mongol warfare and leave an entire continent trembling at the mention of riders from the east. The morning of April 11th dawned with an eerie fog rolling across the Mohi River, as if nature itself was providing cover for the slaughter that was about to unfold. King Bela's massive army had spent the night in what they believed was a secure defensive position, their camp sprawling across several miles of Hungarian countryside. The European commanders were so confident in their numerical superiority that many had already begun discussing how to divide the spoils of their inevitable victory. But while the Europeans slept, the Mongols had been moving. This wasn't the chaotic advance of a barbarian horde that European chroniclers would later describe. This was a precisely coordinated military operation executed with the efficiency of a machine. 3 separate Mongol columns had been maneuvering through the darkness, each following routes that had been scouted and planned weeks in advance. The first column, led by Subutai himself, approached the main bridge across the Mohi River. European sentries, expecting a conventional assault, watched as what appeared to be a relatively small Mongol force began probing their defences. What they didn't realise was that this was merely the opening move in a chess game, where they were already checkmated before the first piece moved. European military doctrine called for meeting enemy attacks head-on, using the defensive advantages of river crossings to channel attacking forces into killing zones where superior European armour and weapons could devastate lighter-armed opponents. The Hungarian commanders positioned their best troops at the bridge, confident that they could hold the crossing indefinitely against any assault. Meanwhile, 30 miles upstream, a second Mongol column was already crossing the river at a ford that European scouts had dismissed as impassable. The Mongols had spent days preparing this crossing, using local knowledge gained through captured prisoners and reconnaissance missions that had penetrated deep into Hungarian territory. By the time European commanders realized what was happening, enemy forces were already moving to surround their massive army. The third Mongol column struck from an entirely unexpected direction. These warriors had covered over 60 miles in a single night march, approaching the European camp from the rear through terrain that Hungarian commanders had considered too difficult for military movements. The Mongols, however, had been born in the saddle on steppes that made Hungarian plains look like carefully manicured gardens. When the attack began just after dawn, it unfolded with such speed and coordination that European commanders struggled to understand what was happening. The assault at the bridge wasn't designed to capture the crossing. It was psychological warfare intended to fix European attention while the real attack developed elsewhere. European knights, trained to respond to direct threats with immediate counterattacks, began forming up for their traditional heavy cavalry charge. These warriors, each worth dozens of common soldiers in terms of training and equipment, represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval military technology. Their horses were massive destriers bred specifically for war, capable of carrying an armored knight at full gallop into enemy formations. But the Mongols refused to provide the stationary target that European tactics required. Instead of forming dense infantry formations or cavalry lines that could be charged and broken, the Mongol units dispersed across the battlefield like smoke, presenting never a solid target for the devastating impact of European heavy cavalry. The European charge, when it finally came, struck nothing but empty air. Mongol horse archers had already withdrawn to predetermined positions where they could rain arrows down on the confused European formations while remaining beyond the reach of European weapons. The knights found themselves pursuing shadows while deadly projectiles fell around them like lethal rain. European armor, designed to deflect sword blows and spear thrusts, proved inadequate against the composite bows used by Mongol warriors. These weapons, perfected over generations of steppe warfare, could drive arrows through mail and even some plate armor at ranges that European crossbows couldn't match. More importantly, Mongol archers could maintain sustained rates of fire while remaining mobile, something European forces had never encountered. The psychological impact was devastating. European knights had built their entire military culture around the concept of decisive close combat where individual skill and courage determined outcomes. Finding themselves under constant arrow fire from enemies they couldn't reach or pin down violated every assumption about how battles were supposed to unfold. As the morning progressed, the true genius of the Mongol battle plan became apparent. The forces that had crossed upstream struck the European camp just as confusion from the arrow storm reached its peak. Thousands of European soldiers who had never seen combat found themselves under attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Mongol assault teams moved with surgical precision, targeting command posts, supply wagons, and communication centers. European armies depended on rigid, hierarchical command structures where orders flowed down from noble commanders to common soldiers. By eliminating key leaders and disrupting command networks, the Mongols created chaos that spread through European ranks like wildfire. European attempts to rally and reform were systematically disrupted by Mongol harassment tactics. Every time Hungarian or Croatian forces began organizing a counterattack, Mongol horse archers would appear from unexpected directions, loose volleys of arrows, and disappear before European heavy cavalry could respond. The river crossing that Europeans had seen as their primary defensive advantage became a trap. With Mongol forces attacking from multiple directions, the bridge became a bottleneck where European soldiers found themselves compressed into killing zones where Mongol arrows could hardly miss their targets. King Bela himself narrowly escaped death when Mongol raiders struck directly at the royal command post. The Hungarian king, who had entered the battle confident of victory, suddenly found himself fleeing for his life as his carefully organized army disintegrated around him. By midday, what had begun as an orderly European defensive position had collapsed into complete chaos. The numerical advantage that should have guaranteed victory had become meaningless when those numbers couldn't be effectively coordinated or deployed against an enemy that refused to fight according to European rules. The slaughter that followed would become the stuff of nightmares for European chroniclers, a demonstration of military efficiency so complete that it challenged everything medieval Christendom believed about warfare, divine favor, and their own supposed superiority over the barbarian peoples of the East. The Battle of Mohi stands as one of history's most devastating demonstrations that superior tactics will always triumph over superior numbers. In a single morning, 20,000 Mongol warriors had shattered the illusion of European military dominance and revealed the fatal flaws in medieval warfare. The age of the heavily armored knight was ending, replaced by a new era where coordination, adaptability, and strategic thinking would determine the fate of nations.